Lyndon Roscoe removed his hat before bowing roughly. He stayed that way, until Ludmilla had to wave him away so he could rejoin his son. Ludmilla and Yelena remained long enough to watch the tall pine crash to the ground with small frowns on their faces before turning to continue along the way along the edge of the forest. Progress in clearing was proceeding according to schedule, but Ludmilla felt things were going far too slowly. Clearing the strip of farmland was a crucial stage in her plans, yet it was only the first. She still needed to build the town, expand the harbor and figure out how to improve her capacity for transport. While doing so, she lost crucial time in securing the ever-shrinking pool of skilled labor that was still loose in the duchy. While the other territories were more than happy to let go of tenants who could be replaced by cheaper undead labor, the exact opposite was true for those industries that undead labor could not impact so easily. She required the revenues generated from the farming villages to begin investing in the town's industries, but, with every passing week, she felt that the time it would take to complete the terraces and the farming outposts, roughly 18 months, would leave her at the mercy of changing economic conditions. Thus, she had decided to lease the 6 columns from the central administration to speed things along. In addition, Lord Mayor's unexpected interest in her plans was a great boon and her projections improved considerably as a result. In the end, the time required to finish this stage of development had been reduced to 6 months. Even so, Ludmilla still felt time and opportunity continuing to slip through her fingers as the days went by. Compared to Clara's progress in Calling County, the development in Warden's Vale was like a molehill beside a mountain. Not that they were competing. Clara always happily snapped up the timber sent downriver to supply her own development, and Ludmilla could trust her to pay fairly and on time. Clara would be purchasing all of her grain exports to keep up with the demands of her greatly expanded domain, which specialized in vineyards, orchards and crops of various low-growing fruits and vegetables, as well as the culinary and medicinal herbs that grew in the same space. She had apiaries in great abundance as well. Her entire domain was a land overflowing in luxuries, spices and herbs, oils and perfumes, wines, mead, fruity beverages and desserts, all of which the existence of undead labor had minimal impact upon. If anything, the burgeoning population that resulted from the abundance of food in the future would drive up the prices of her goods, making her even wealthier than before. One could not help but envy her position, yet Clara did not rest idly in her advantage. Her entire territory continued to improve in leaps and bounds as she pursued what nearly anyone would consider a nigh impossible vision for her realm. Ludmilla, on the other hand, was barely started. She and Yelena walked slowly through the dried piles of cleared undergrowth while they watched the next woodcutter team. A Death Knight stood watch over the tree line, yet she continued to scan her surroundings. As with most of the Sorceress Kingdom's undead forces, the towering sentry was not actually entirely suited for being, well, a sentry. They were excellent in defending against threats in plain view, which made them ideal for guarding cities and towns. Out here, however, she had to combine them with the bone vultures overhead to keep even modestly sneaky threats at bay. The woodcutters were made aware of this as well. If they felt that something was amiss, they were instructed to run to the nearest Death Knight and make it aware of the situation. She continued to note the changes since her last visit, until a casual glance towards the western slope of the valley stopped her in her tracks. There was a grey something making its way through the undergrowth along the edge of the clearing. It was certainly nowhere near as large as the feline demi-human that was encountered several days ago. Going by the trees and bushes it was traversing through, it was not even a meter high. "Do you see that?" she asked Yelena. The girl peered in the direction Ludmilla indicated for a while, then shook her head. Since an untrained village girl could not detect it, despite her natural aptitudes, she thought that the creature might at least have some inherent skill at concealment. That didn't make it an immediate threat, however. Many animals were naturally stealthy. "I'm going to take a closer look," she told Yelena. "Head back to the Death Knight and wait there." Yelena immediately turned around and retraced their steps. Looking to the sky, Ludmilla called over 2 bone vultures patrolling overhead and stalked towards the slope. She was keenly aware that she had no armament, so she would need to rely on the undead under her command if her quarry turned out to be hostile. The grey color appeared to be from some sort of hide or coat, giving the creature a roughly sheep-like appearance. Except this sheep appeared to have a set of branched antlers extending from its head and over its back. A tail with a spaded point twitched back and forth as it continued through the trees in a strange, loping fashion. It stopped, and Ludmilla froze in place as it reared up on its hooved hind legs, grasping at a nearby trunk with one of its three-toed forelegs. It sniffed at the air cautiously, but did not seem to be aware of her presence. It continued standing there and, after a few seconds, Ludmilla realized that, unlike a sheep or a deer or whatever strange mix of animals it appeared to be, this creature did not have two eyes, it had three. The third eye was set on its forehead, and it was staring straight up at the sky overhead. Ludmilla looked up and silently instructed the bone vultures to fly away to safety. Before they could wheel back around, two bolts of silver light streaked down from the sky and drove them violently into the debris of the cleared field. Masses of unpleasantly familiar vines snaked out of the ground to bind the two flailing undead before they could right themselves again. The creature turned its attention in her direction, and Ludmilla heard the rapid approach of metal-shod boots. The Death Knight sentry darted by her with a roar, plowing through the debris with its shield leading the way and flambeau held high. It didn't quite make it halfway between them, though, as another set of vines whipped out and anchored it to the ground. Ludmilla half expected Yelena to appear but, thankfully, the girl hadn't doggedly tried to follow her instructions to stay with the Death Knight. The creature returned to all fours, loping out from the trees. It sized up the Death Knight with an unconcerned air even as the powerful undead being glared back at it from merely 20 meters away. Its apparent composure caused Ludmilla to be uncertain of the outcome, and she turned and called out towards the farming village. "Nonna, I need you out here now." She felt the drain as she cast her voice to the village roughly 4 kilometers distant. The ability still gave no indication as to whether it succeeded or not, but, hopefully, it reached its intended target. The sight that greeted her when she turned her attention back to the standoff continued to build on her uneasy feelings. The creature was now floating in the air, roughly 10 meters from the ground and rising. It stared down at the Death Knight with the same, unruffled attitude. The Death Knight, its legs still bound by the entangling vines, bent over to lift a boulder the size of Ludmilla's torso out of the ground before it. "Eye of the storm." With a voice that sounded oddly exactly how Ludmilla thought a sheep would if one could talk, the creature cast a spell. The Death Knight hurled the boulder but, when the projectile came within 3 lengths of its intended target, it was cast aside like a piece of straw. Leaves and debris were being swept up from below, slowly forming into a swirling sphere surrounding the creature at roughly the distance that the boulder had been so easily deflected. A gnarled branch and a smaller stone flew up from the Death Knight as it attempted to hit the creature again and again to no avail. The creature continued to look down from its barrier of wind. Its sheep-like voice sounded over the roar of the frustrated Death Knight. "Inferno!" The Death Knight exploded into flames. Its restraints instantly burned away, and it ran forward all alight, leaping from below its tormentor in a vain attempt to reach it. The Death Knight finally threw its flambeau and its arm came off at the shoulder, still holding the hilt of the weapon. The flaming limb grasping the massive blade was flicked away with no more difficulty than any other projectile that had come before. Ludmilla finally rose from her concealed position, quickly coming forward in an attempt to salvage the situation. "Stop!" she called up to the creature, "Why are you picking on my sentries?" The creature looked down at her, or rather, it tilted its head to focus its central eye on her. The rectangular pupils of its other eyes kept watch on its surroundings. "You come to the defense of the undead, Ranger. Why? How do you know I am a ranger?" "It is druids and rangers that can traverse over rough terrain so effortlessly. You do not have the sense of being a spellcaster." It was nice to be immediately recognized as a ranger, for once. The Death Knight's other arm burned off. "You have entered my territory," Ludmilla said. "Is it your intent to challenge us for it?" "The undead carry risks to the living," it stated. "This is simple to understand, yes? These undead are under my command." "Ridiculous. A ranger professes to manage undead?" "It stopped when I said so, did it not? If aggression is not your intent, then why are you here? Your kind is unfamiliar to this place." A brief silence passed as the eye seemed to measure her. There was a rustle on the ground as one of the bone vultures was released from the entangling vines, and it took wing to resume its watch overhead. Its companion soon followed, and the flames consuming the Death Knight receded. Ludmilla stepped forward slowly to examine the remains of her sentry, All of its limbs had been burned away, its head as well. An undead being capable of destroying entire countries had been reduced to little more than a torso in a half-melted breastplate on the ground. It still rocked and twisted in effort to right itself. "Good work holding out there," she said, and the Death Knight ceased its movements. "Nonna should be able to fix you up." She reached down to pat the Death Knight's breastplate, but stopped upon feeling the waves of heat emanating from the dark metal. The winds around the being overhead vanished, and it floated to the ground in front of her. Now that she was able to gauge it properly, she could not tell how strong it actually was, and that made it incredibly strong. By appearance alone, it was deceptively weak-looking for something that had disabled the Death Knight so easily. It stood at about half a meter when on all fours, the long antlers that extended halfway over the thick, grey, wool covering its body added perhaps another third to that. Unlike the rectangular pupils of its two other eyes, the third eye had a round one which focused on her intently. Its rear legs ended in hooves like one might expect from a sheep or a goat, but its forelegs had two stubby fingers and a thumb which she had seen grasping the tree trunk from a distance. "I am Ludmilla Zaradnik," she introduced herself politely, "Baroness of Wardensvale." The eye peered up at her with a lidded gaze. Such a pointless introduction. "Pointless?" "Yes," the small creature at her feet replied, "pointless. Shallow. Weak. You spoke your name, yes? Your mouth moves, your voice cries, yet your heart does not sing. I hear the sound of your name, yet it means nothing. A hollow declaration. Do you fear? Or is it shame? Or are you such a pitiful existence that you do not even know who you are?" Ludmilla looked down in confusion at the string of questions. Was it referring to the mysterious way in which the world allowed communication between different peoples, conveying language and concepts to those who could understand them? The being at her feet let out a breath that she thought was probably a sigh. "You struggle to comprehend," it said. "Then allow me to introduce myself." It gave a short bleat, and a long string of ideas accompanied it. Rather than being composed of any coherent sentences, meaning came in a single, condensed bundle. While Ludmilla understood that all it had done was issue the brief sound, what unspooled before her perception was a collection of associations that painted an identity in her mind. After absorbing the name, Ludmilla understood who he was, and she had no idea how one could convey their identity in that manner. "My people don't speak like that," Ludmilla explained. "I am uncertain if any race or creature I have encountered around here does." "All can speak like this," it replied. "It is unfortunate that your kind seems to have lost the how, or maybe never knew. Yet, I sense that you are able. I hear the faint echoes of it in your words. You knew me when I named myself. Perhaps you simply do not know that you can." With that, he turned around and headed back towards the trees. "Wait," Ludmilla asked. "Where are you going?" "Away. I cannot know you, so we can never truly understand one another. Your soul is closed to me, and so I shall move on." Ludmilla thought over their brief exchange, and she racked her mind for a suitable answer. All words and names had associations, but, in the languages that she knew, they only meant what they meant and meaning could change or be lost to time. Certainly, some words carried a certain intangible weight when expressed in various ways, but she did not feel that they fully manifested what he wished to know. The short bleat that was his name, once understood, coalesced into what she could only describe as an image perceived as a whole in her mind. It was not anything one could grasp with a single, physical sense. Every minute detail was a part of him, trying to latch onto a single element to make sense out of it made the whole lose its meaning. It was him and he just was. He had simply expressed the essence of himself, yet there was nothing simple about doing so. Humans had names, and those names had meanings. Some liked to believe that names also had power. Yet these names were usually bestowed to one by their parents, who themselves might not even know their meaning. Whether one lived up to that name in the end was a whim of fate at best. Lady Shiltier asked a similar question just 2 months ago, a question that she had been unable to answer. "Who are you?" "I am Ludmilla Zaradnik," she called out after him. "Baroness of Wardensvale." They were not just words this time. While Lady Shiltier used words just like her, what she conveyed did not contain any events or achievements, no transient ties or idle aspirations. Stripped of all the things that did not matter, Ludmilla invested what she thought must be the essence of her being, and it felt like a piece of herself was carried away as she expressed her identity to the receding figure. He immediately stopped, ears and tail twitching. After standing in place for a few minutes, he turned back around again and returned to stand before her. To Ludmilla's surprise, he closed his eyes and lowered his head. "Warden of the Vale," he said. "There is something we would ask of you." "What in the world just happened?" Ludmilla stared down blankly at the lowered head before her, unable to comprehend why both the literal and figurative change in direction had occurred. In doing something entirely unfamiliar to her, something unintended had happened as a result, something she had no idea about. This is quite the change in attitude. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know what it wanted. "You told me who you were," he replied, "so now I know." "How do you know I am what I said?" Ludmilla said, "Going by your reaction, I appear to have done something completely unintended." "Unintended?" The creature tilted its head to look up at her. "This is not an expression of intent, it is an expression of being. The soul cannot lie, and you cannot be any less than what you are. Claiming to be more is equally impossible. Even in the long passage of time, it is not easily changed, and if it is, then it is." The explanation did not make much sense, or did it? By doing something she didn't fully understand the consequences of, he had come to some sort of perfect understanding, and now he was acting accordingly with the assurance that what he knew could not be untrue. If Ludmilla wasn't aware that she indeed did something along those lines, she might have wondered if she was actually dealing with some sort of lunatic. Or maybe she was the one that was going crazy. Rather than dwelling on it and inviting insanity for certain, she decided to address his request. "You said that." The creature's head turned sharply away from her, towards the village. Ludmilla cut her words short, looking to see what had drawn his attention. Nonna was descending in their direction from the farming village. "She is one of mine," Ludmilla said. "I called for her when you started attacking my sentries." Despite her explanation, the creature continued eyeing the approaching elder lich. She didn't believe that hostilities would break out again, given the creature's stark reversal in disposition, but, if they did, she suspected that Nonna would lose just as one-sidedly as the Death Knight did. Scanning her surroundings for potential problems, she saw that two teams of the nearby woodcutters were still fleeing towards the road. Yelena's head poked up from the field where the Death Knight had been standing sentry. "The fight is over, you can go back to work." The men in the distance stopped and looked towards her. After a few seconds, they started walking back towards their work sites. She didn't call Yelena to her, in the event that hostilities somehow recommenced. Looking around for a few more minutes and finding nothing else amiss, she turned her attention back to Nonna, who had finally arrived. "Did you leave right when I called for you?" Ludmilla asked as the elder lich settled to the ground. "Yes, roughly 12 minutes ago," Nonna replied. "That's unexpectedly slow," Ludmilla frowned. "I can run faster than that." "The fly spell has limitations in speed," Nonna said. "It is not the same as the natural ability to fly. For traveling longer distances, teleportation magic is instantaneous and more mana efficient." "You don't have that, so you used fly." "That is correct. Teleportation is not in my repertoire." Ludmilla spent what time she could spare remedying shortfalls in her knowledge, and magic was one thing she focused on in particular. Beyond the spells used by Bohadan in the past, she knew very little, and it was something she decided would be a crucial aspect of working knowledge as a noble of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. With Nonna on hand in the domain, Ludmilla was able to speak at length about the subject. She also had her demonstrate each spell she possessed so she could think on their potential applications. The majority of elder liches used as administrative servitors in the Sorcerer's Kingdom all appeared to have the same set of spells, though it appeared that certain ones could do more. Nonna was capable of casting a few Tier 5 spells, but they were few and limited to direct combat. "Well, it is good that you made it out here regardless," Ludmilla told her. "One of our Death Knights is on the ground over there. You can use Ray of Negative Energy to patch it up, right?" Nonna looked over to the Death Knight torso lying on the ground nearby. Though the heat from the flames had dissipated, the odors of charred flesh and burnt debris still lingered. "How did this happen?" "There was a misunderstanding just now between this fellow here and the sentries," Ludmilla told Nonna. "He stopped before it was a total loss, so recovery is just a matter of time, yes?" I will call one of the sentries at the village to take this post while you take care of things. This will take a substantial amount of mana, Nonna said. I will heal it until movement is restored, then take it back to the village. Moranbor should be available to assist. Moranbor can cast Ray of Negative Energy? Yes, Nonna replied. He has been assisting with patching up servitors that take minor damage from workplace incidents. It is not much, by my measure, but it is something. Do you have a record of all of this? Only to the extent of gauging its performance. Then start keeping track of the maintenance work, Ludmilla said. If we are going to be employing magic casters in this way, I will have to figure out what sort of remuneration is suitable for their labor, mana. For the time being, make sure he only does so under your supervision until we figure it out. As she said so, Ludmilla realized that Nonna wasn't receiving any compensation for her magic, either. Speaking of which, she asked, do you receive a wage of some sort from the administration? It might be useful for comparison. I do not. Was that something I was supposed to be taking care of? She furrowed her brow. I thought the lease covered that, but you did not come with one. All that is required of you is that you pay the lease under normal circumstances, Nonna told her. His Majesty's summons exist to serve, we do not require wages. If there is something that we deem necessary, it is provided freely. I see, that's between you and the administration, I suppose. I need to find out what this fellow is doing here, so I will leave the Death Knight to you. They turned left Nonna behind them, and Ludmilla called for a Death Knight from the village as they headed back towards the road. Yelena stood up from where she had been hiding, looking to her, then the strange creature walking beside her. The girl stuck out her hand towards him, and he sniffed at it for a few seconds. This female does not smell like your offspring, he said. Good, she felt the corner of her mouth twitch, because I think I would remember that. This one is called Yelena, she is the daughter of one of the men working nearby. Speaking of names, is there one you go by normally? I told you who I am, Itsuprai blinked up at her as they continued on their way. There is no short form? Our people generally use names in the manner I first introduced myself, and I am not sure I can get your whole identity quite right anyways. Is it offensive to be called in such a way? There is no precedent for offense or otherwise, he replied. Our people live isolated from the world, it is a rare thing to encounter outsiders where we live. We only speak to others of our people, so there is no need for such things. Considering he had simply turned around and started to leave when she was unable to introduce herself properly, Ludmilla imagined that they would not require anything like the names that others used. Having to call out his full identity in the manner that she just had her own, however. Then what about a title? She asked, is there some position you occupy amongst your people? You are powerful enough to burn a Death Knight to the ground with seemingly little effort. Destroying most undead is a simple matter, he answered, their weaknesses are easily recognizable. If you insist on using one of these shallow appellations, then Volkv. I am a Volkv of the Chronos. The Volkv's words gave her pause. The terms were old, she only knew them as something her parents taught her when she was very young, before she joined her brothers under Bohadan's tutelage. Volkv had become synonymous with priest, yet it did not carry the exact same connotations as members of the priesthoods in the local human lands. It defined a slightly different role than the ubiquitous term used by most implied. Chronos, is this the name of your people? Your nation? It is the name of our people, who are named after the mountains to the west which we called home. Chronos was what Ludmilla's people called the range of mountains to the west, which extended all the way to the ocean. The windward side of the range, of which Warden's Vale lay within, was cool, wet and windblown, thick with the vegetation which was its namesake. The range did have an official name, yet again their village's name that described it had come out instead. These people had named themselves after the place that they lived, and their concept of their home matched her people's own, creating an image of a region known to both. If not for her upbringing, the more commonly known names for these terms would have probably been heard, and the full meaning lost upon the listener. She was beginning to understand why he thought that her use of language was shallow. Why did you leave? Ludmilla asked. For what reason have you come here? Because we decided that we could not stay, the Volkv's coat rippled. 3 seasons ago, an evil star fell into the wilderness far to the west. And just seeing this evil star was enough to cause you to flee? Not at first, he said. At first, we watched from our craggy peaks. We cast spells to scry the vast lands to the south, to divine what had befallen the low places. The source was veiled from us, but we watched as waves of ruin rippled out from where the star fell, over the peoples that dwelled there. Those that fought to defend their ancestral lands were captured or slain, heedless of tribe or creed. Many who fled were also captured or slain, but there were also those who escaped. We did not stay to determine the fate of the ones who cast themselves at the mercy of this great evil. They reached the old road, and Ludmilla led them in the direction of the farming village. The Death Knight she had called stomped by to assume its post. It was several times faster than Nonna using flight magic. How many of your people died? None. We were too far away, safe in our high mountain peaks, and we left long before the darkness could reach us. Our people went away before the first of the distant Xian enclaves fell into shadow. Who are Xian? An insectoid people. Of a sort, the Volk said. As different from you and I as we are to each other, if not more so. They have dwelled in their holes in the foothills below our mountains for nearly as long as we ourselves have dwelled on our peaks. We were vaguely aware of one another, but nothing more. It was another race she had never heard of. The story of the Kronos was recognizable enough, however, they were refugees fleeing what they considered a great threat. Given the power of the individual trotting alongside her, Ludmilla was compelled to learn more, but information usually came at a price. So you arrived here, fleeing this great evil that has befallen the land, now you wish to enter mine. That was our original purpose, to cross this great river and continue over the mountains again, until we could continue no longer. It was, until I came to know who you are. Why would knowing who I am change your decision to continue fleeing? Ludmilla asked. The Vulk's central eye blinked up at her, then it tilted its head to look at her with one of its goat-like eyes. Knowing who you are is all that there is, he answered. Upon hearing it, I knew your place in this world, and there is no better place in this world for my people than under your protection, Warden. I will be perfectly frank and tell you that I have absolutely no idea how you arrived at this conclusion. You should know how much more powerful you are compared to me, yes? In these measures you can be, yes. But that does not matter. What matters is what matters, what the world has decided you are to be. Are you talking about something like fate? Ludmilla asked, did you use some magic to divine my future? It is not magic, the Volk answered, it is soul. The whole has determined your parts, your paths, your place. You gave to me your name, I returned it to you. Even so, you did not understand? I understood what I conveyed to you, and I understood what you called me, but I cannot understand why we understand it so differently. I understand what is, he said. You will come to understand as well. You cannot be any less than what you are, even if you do not understand what you are. Understanding is not required for this to come to pass. Currently, what she understood was if she was subjected to any more understanding, she might permanently start talking like the Volk. Or her head might ignite like her Death Knight. In asking too much, she had learned too much to digest. Then let us discuss the matter at hand, Ludmilla cleared her throat. Your request is to move into my territory, but do you realize what that entails? We will come under your management as a part of the land, the Volk replied immediately. You will do what is necessary, and we will do as you say. Very broadly speaking, that was what would happen. It was not language a noble or some learned human citizen would use, however. The way he appeared to exercise thought and employ vocabulary was more in line with a druid or a ranger, whose scales of judgment assessed things holistically rather than singularly. As I said, he spoke in her silence, I know who you are. What is. My people will be in your care, and we would not protest even if you saw fit to kill us all. Even if I had a very good reason, Ludmilla told him, it is not a decision that I would make lightly. I know. The rational part of her mind still screamed at the reasoning that would not make any sense whatsoever if viewed from the perspective of a human noble. The other parts of her, however, accepted it for what it was. The fact that any human noble would immediately accept such a one-sided agreement in their favor while she fought the reasoning due to the part of her that had already accepted it was an irony that irritated her to no end. Ludmilla sighed. She would just have to navigate this confusing situation in what way she could. Then, how many of your people have come with you? She asked the Volk. And what do you need to live? We are 400, the Volk said, and 50. So, 450? The sun had nearly crossed below the western ridge of the valley, granting a reprieve from the sweltering heat of the day. Gusts of cool evening wind played over the fields, and Ludmilla's skirts occasionally whipped forward as she and the Volk continued on their way towards the farming village. 450 would be more precise, the Volk explained. The 400 are like me, druids who live in the alpine meadows and amongst the craggy peaks. The 50 are rangers who stalk below. 400 druids? Ludmilla's words rolled out in near disbelief. What about the rest? Magic casters were relatively rare, and the current shortage of them in the Sorceress Kingdom made that abundantly clear. While the territory was still a part of Riestais, there were probably only 600 or so professional magic casters in the Duchy of Erantel. Once divided into their various vocations and considering the potency of spells that most could use, it was easy to see how recent events had led to their current situation. According to the information gathered by the House of Lords, it was estimated that 80% of the magic casters working in the duchy had fled before or during the annexation process. They held positions which were always in demand throughout human lands, so it was a simple matter for them to uproot themselves and find new homes for themselves. The majority who remained were either divine casters who opted to remain and serve their congregations, a handful of crafters, and the few adventurers who had signed on with the repurposed Adventurer Guild. The Magician Guild, even if one counted the magical crafters who were members under the organization's umbrella, was a ghost of its former self and gutted of anything useful. They had quickly emptied their inventories to be transported to Riestais before the transfer of authority. Needless to say, the various trade guilds under the Merchant Guild similarly saw the same decline in membership. Specifically, the dire drop in the mages who provided utility and crafting services to the citizenry was nothing short of a silent crisis. Until something was done to restore these losses, the Sorceress Kingdom would be mostly dependent on expensive imports from the Empire and beyond. The nation was in the oddly embarrassing position of having very little in terms of magical industries, despite possessing superlative magical might. The rest are the 50, I said this, yes? I meant those that are not druids or rangers, Ludmilla told the Volk. Amongst my people, becoming a druid is relatively rare. Ah, he replied, so it is like that. Our people are all born druids or rangers, it is not a path to be pursued like some other races we have observed. I made an erroneous assumption. You expressed yourself as a ranger. This youngling also exhibits the qualities of a ranger. Those males we passed also have ranger-like traits, so it was my assumption that your kind are all born rangers, and you are lord of your race. When he put it in those terms, Ludmilla supposed that humans were actually in the minority when it came to how each individual developed. When it came to demi-humans, it was more often than not that each race lent to what would be considered a specific vocation by human measure. Gnolls were natural rangers, ogres were barbarians, trolls were fighters. Even if a member of that race filled the role of a druid, shaman or some other magic caster, their natural strengths would still come into play. Though she knew of several, a race of natural magic casters was unheard of in the immediate vicinity of Warden's Vale. She could not recall any who were either one thing or another. My race is referred to as human, but I thought you knew who I was when I expressed myself. I did, and I still do. Knowing the quality of one's soul does not define an individual in those terms, it simply expresses what one is. Despite herself, she knew what he was saying. Their culture appeared to be one which revolved around nature, straightforward and true to spirit and form. The way in which the Volk perceived the world and conveyed his words made much more sense when viewed through that lens. Rather than perceiving her through individualistic terms, she was being identified by her place within a much wider framework. Ludmilla suspected that, even if they were druids, they would not be overly useful to the duchy at large. They were probably akin to those druids who lived apart from civilization as hermits, or in isolated circles that watched over their little part of nature. Perhaps time and understanding would help her figure out how they could further contribute to the overall state of her domain. All right, so these 400, what do you eat? Do you build? Craft? We graze on the vegetation that grows at those heights that we live in, lichen, moss, alpine plants. In the frozen seasons, we move down into the warmer elevations. We do not build. The rangers will occasionally fashion objects, but we druids do not. Between our bodies and our magic, we have everything we need. The Chronos seemed to loosely have the grazing habits of the sheep or goats that they resembled. They were maybe half the size of a mountain sheep, but the Volk had demonstrated enough magical might to easily destroy a Death Knight. His placid nature when confronting it just seemed to be how he always was, which was fortunate for their neighbors. Being overrun by hundreds of these cute and fluffy druids would be irresistible in multiple ways. Do your people's rangers do anything else differently? Ludmilla asked. By your description, they demonstrate several different habits.
Yes,
the Volk replied. They are usually always below, stalking the wooded slopes under our homes and keeping others away. They do not eat the same things that we druids do. I guess that makes sense, considering they do not live at the same altitude. They feed on leaves and grass, then? The Volk eyed her strangely, tilting its head so that two of its eyes could take her in at once. They feed on us, it replied. About 100 meters from the entrance to the farming village, Ludmilla abruptly stopped in her tracks and Yelena bumped into her from behind. I'm not sure if I heard that right. They, the rangers, feed on us, the druids, he said slowly. This should be the meaning of what I said, yes?
Yes, but,
The Chronos is a species that practices cannibalism?
No wait.
I thought you fed on vegetation. The druids do, yes. The rangers are carnivorous. We are one people, but we are not the same species. Did you think us an insect race which can produce multiple types of individuals? Do human rangers eat human druids? I cannot say that I have ever done that, not knowingly, anyways. They resumed walking, ascending the ramp leading to the warehouse half of the village. Yelena waved to them as she went her own way, up the ramp to the common area, and Ludmilla waved back. 2 permanent warehouses had been raised so far, but most of the labor allocated to the storage area had been focused into getting the grain silos ready for the harvest. A dozen had been constructed, raised off of the ground so that their contents could be poured out of a spout below. A dozen more were still at various stages of completion. Walking together to the eastern edge of the village, she tried to puzzle out what exactly the Chronos were as they looked over the valley stretching out below. Generally speaking, she said after a few minutes, one intelligent race that eats another does not get along with them past a certain point, if at all. Yet here you are claiming that you are one people. I suppose you are correct, he admitted, but it can happen if the circumstances allow for it. I do not doubt there are others with such an arrangement in the wide world. As for the Chronos, we have been one people for countless ages. The fall of dragonkind is but a recent memory to us. The fall of dragonkind. A somewhat exciting, but brief, event, the Volk's voice seemed to shrug. In the span of eons, it was half a wink in time. Changes come, the world turns, those who cannot survive are lost to the mists of eternity. It is not the first time that the keepers have been overturned and others rise to take their place. The soul of the world ever flows, ever grows in uncountable fragments which come and go. That's, right, you've lost me completely now? Perhaps you will perceive this at some point, the Volk said. Before your own returns to the fold. As interesting as talk about dragons might be, Ludmilla still had to figure out what was going on with the Chronos. Clearing her throat, she steered the discussion back on track. What are these circumstances that allow for you to exist together as predator and prey? We are fecund, the Volk answered, and life in the high places comes with its own dangers, as you might imagine. Only the strong can survive. That was a lot more practical of a reason than I thought it would be. Practical, yes. You understand, Warden. Order must be maintained, balance must be kept. If that is the case, how much of the range did you occupy? How much land is required to sustain 400 of you? And the 50? Our ancestral home is a smaller range of peaks, north of the Zone enclaves and west of the mountains under which the dominion of the dwarves lies. As only the strongest of our offspring survive, our numbers do not increase very quickly. The Zrits offer the remains of those whose lives have been claimed by the mountain to the rangers below. Those who reach the end of their days similarly offer themselves, after the wisdom of their lives has been passed on to the next generation. So you are not being hunted for food by your rangers? Nature takes its course, the Volk said simply. Those who do not grow quickly enough cannot survive. The elements take them. They cannot defend against large, flying predators or fail to compete for mates. They cannot migrate when they need to. Many dangers await on the mountain. The Zrets find the fallen and send them to the other half of our people. How often does your species bear offspring? Our breeding seasons come in summer and winter. The females give birth to 3 or 4 the next season. The offspring are left to fend for themselves before the next litter is born. They bred nearly as fast as goblins, and matured far faster. She started to wonder if this ancient relationship had its roots in necessity. Even a slight improvement in their living conditions would have them covering the mountains in short order. What happens if your numbers are lower than usual? Ludmilla asked after a rough calculation. Do these rangers eat anything else? Of course, he replied. When outranging beyond the immediate area of our peaks, they will hunt and consume other things. This creates a wide area around our homes where any who dare approach risk becoming their prey. Are there other benefits to your arrangement? They do not have to range too far to sustain themselves and, by staying in the area, they keep all others from the lowlands away. They also warn us when changes occur, such as that which has happened recently. So, that's the extent of it? There must be some other reason you consider yourselves one people. What you've described so far might be better described as something like keeping pets that eat you on a regular basis. There are social aspects as well. We mingle frequently. Some of my greatest friends are of the Rangers. Even though they'll eat you one day, Ludmilla said flatly. To be consumed by an old friend is a desirable thing. She had no answer to that. The relationship between the two races of the Kronos was just far too alien to her own understanding. What is the lifespan of your people? Ludmilla asked. Fecund races are usually short-lived. It is uncommon for us to live past 80 seasons. As in 4 seasons every winter? Yes, 20 winters. How old are you anyways? This will be my 34th season. Are you telling me that an 8-year-old nearly obliterated one of my death knights with no apparent difficulty? There is nothing strange about this. Nothing strange. Wait, does that mean your entire race becomes as powerful as you? What tier of magic are your people capable of? If one of our young cannot cast the 3rd circle of magic by the end of their 1st year, they are not expected to survive. We become capable of 4th circle magic by our 3rd year, and 5th circle magic by our 6th year. After that, it varies a little, perhaps 1 in 100 will become capable of more. Ludmilla briefly envisioned a wave of antlers, fluff and death if anyone managed to anger the Kronos somehow. Another thought crossed her mind. How about your rangers? The Valk was silent for a moment, nose twitching in the wind as it seemed to think on its answer. This is more difficult to measure. The majority become roughly as strong as our 3rd years, while perhaps 1 in several hundred match with our 5th years. That is the most straightforward comparison I can come up with, fashioned roughly in terms you might understand. Has it ever occurred to you that you could conquer entire swathes of the region with your population? Ludmilla said it half-jokingly, but, even with what little she knew of magic now, she did not think that Riestais or Baharuth could stand against so many powerful casters. Even a single Kronos probably had the strength to shatter the entire army of Riestais. Conquest seems a pointless exercise, the Valk replied. Our ways make us stronger with the passing of thousands of generations, and our magic provides us with all that we need. We are not a race of builders such as yours. Having more land ultimately means nothing to our ways. We only need what we need. The passing of the ages makes us stronger, and we need not enter into conflict like the races below. The day will come when more of our offspring survive and our numbers swell, but there are innumerable peaks in the world that we can migrate to. This has happened before, far in the past. You mean there are other populations of Kronos in these mountains? No, only our own, the Valk told her. Once we were a multitude throughout these ranges. The peaks were higher, but the weather was warmer. A dragon moved in at some point and, with the addition of her offspring, most of us were hunted off of the mountains over the ages before the remainder finally adapted to survive them. Several millennia after that came the fall of dragonkind, leaving the Kronos uncontested in our peaks. Up to this point, Ludmilla thought that the Kronos' way of cultivating strength through generations was similar to what was promoted by the tenets of the 6 great gods. Their conditions for survival, however, were merciless. Being innate magic casters that bred rapidly enabled them to grow a population of astonishing power. Fortunately for their neighbors, their passive disposition was at odds with their sheer strength. Humans would almost certainly exploit such an advantage. The nature of the Kronos request felt akin to having wildlife apply for immigration. They would most likely just become a part of nature in her domain. They did not appear to compete directly with her subjects in any way, so she did not particularly mind them. Since they took care of themselves and did not require any support from her, any benefits she gained in the future from their presence would be essentially free, so she could take time to figure that part out. Unfortunately, the arrangement of their society ran afoul of one of the laws of the Sorceress Kingdom. Subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom were not allowed to eat fellow subjects. As the Kronos would submit themselves to her management, they would become her subjects. Continuing in their practices meant that they would be breaking that law thousands of times a year. A noble could not enact local laws that opposed the crown laws, so she would need a petition for a special ordinance to make an exception for the relationship between the two species. The central administration generally processed things in a speedy manner, so, if she could make a solid case for them, Ludmilla thought she could have it taken care of the next time she was in the city. Lady Sheltier would be coming by in the next day or two, so she could consult with her on the matter as well. Another issue concerned the rangers mentioned in their discussion. Ludmilla was taught that carnivorous and territorial species stood a high chance of being problematically aggressive when it came to interactions with their neighbors. Rather than a matter of reason, it was an aspect of nature that was not so easily changed. Demi-humans and monsters with such a nature had a risk of exploding violently even when things appeared peaceful mere seconds before. Hopefully, their ancient bonds with the druids of the Kronos meant that there was an avenue for their natural tendencies to follow that did not cause problems when they encountered other subjects. "I do not think that you have described the appearance of your rangers," Ludmilla said. "They seem to be large and powerful, judging by their diet and your estimations." "Yes, you are correct," the Valkyrie twitched. "They average between 3 to 4 meters in length as adults, with the appearance of mountain leopards. Some appeared around this place recently, but reported back that one of their number was lost. For this reason, I came to investigate."